friends. It's been a minute since my last video. I have been busy building stuff, just haven't had a lot of time to document the process. I've also been super busy with my small business Barn 3, where we build guitar pedals, and I also started a silly little podcast called Cinemartyr with my buddy Dr. Mike, where we talk about movies and the psychological, spiritual, and mythological themes in those movies. So if that's something you're into, go ahead and check that out. Anyway, I've been tooling around with an idea in my head for a while now, and I thought this would actually be a good process to capture and make into a video. So a little bit of background. We have this weird window in our dining room area, and it's this octagon-shaped window, and it's bothered me ever since we moved in because none of the trim lines up. It's crooked. It's been painted 1,000 times. It just looks like crap. So I thought, let's make a new custom window, and since it's my girlfriend's birthday, I'll make something special for her. This past year, she had to make the hard decision to put her cat Tyrion down. She had rescued Tyrion a couple years ago out of a literal gutter, and he had tons of health problems, the most severe of which were chronic epileptic seizures. And despite her best efforts at giving him a good life, our vet advised us that it was time to say goodbye. So today we're going to build a custom stained glass window to honor St. Tyrion of Briar. So the first step was to dismantle the old window and get all the measurements I needed. I started by removing this awful trim. Then I took out the old window, cleaned up the wall, and gave it a fresh coat of paint. So while the paint was drying, I started working on the new frame. The frame is real basic. I just took some 5/4 stock and ripped it down to 2 1/8 inches wide. Then I cut the pieces to length on the miter saw at 22.5-degree angles. And here I'm cutting the rabbet into the back of the pieces, which will make a pocket for the glass to sit in later. I made sure that all the pieces lined up, and nothing fancy here. I just glued the pieces together and used a ratchet strap to hold it together while it dried. While the glue dried on the frame, I decided to start cutting up the pieces I needed for the trim. And this was the same basic process as the frame, just some 22.5-degree cuts, one extra trip to Lowe's because I miscalculated how much trim I needed, some staining, and finally attaching to the wall. With the trim done, now I could go ahead and finish up the frame for the window. Here I'm using the router to give it a nice subtle round over on the inside edge. I did some final sanding with the orbital sander and a little bit of hand sanding here and there.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
And once I was happy with that, I went ahead and stained it. I gave it a clear coat to protect it from the elements. Then I took the hardware off the old window, installed it on the new one, and gave it a test fit just to make sure everything was going to line up properly. And now it's time to get to the fun part of the build, the stained glass. This was so time-consuming, but so incredibly worth it. Again, I'm not an expert. I watched some tutorials. When I was a kid, my parents did stained glass, so I had a basic understanding of how this all worked, but I was not prepared for how involved this was going to be. But for me, most of the fun of these projects is learning the new skills, not necessarily just the end result. So I started with a picture that I had of Tyrion, and I traced his outline, and then I started adding all the elements in the background that I wanted. And initially, I actually had a way more complex design, but after realizing that it was going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 individual pieces of glass, I decided to dial that back, and I came up with the final design that you see here. I printed out a couple copies of the design at full scale, one of which I'll be using to cut up individual patterns, and one of which I'll be using to lay the glass on as I'm going so I can keep track of what I'm doing. Now that the design was all taped together, it was time to start cutting out the individual shapes. Now to do this, you use a special pair of scissors called pattern shears. And what's special about them is when you're cutting, they actually remove a small bit of paper in between the line that you're cutting, which gives room for the copper foil that you have to add later when doing the actual stained glass. Once I had all the patterns cut out, it was finally time to start cutting glass. Now again, I haven't had a ton of experience with this and I saw different methods of the best way to do this, but the method I chose to go with was to just use a glue stick and glue the patterns directly onto the glass. Once the pattern is on the glass, you use this tool called a glass cutter. And all it does is it gives a light scoring onto the glass so that you can then break it on that score line. On the straight lines, you can use a straight edge to keep your lines nice and perfect. And then on the curved lines, you just have to freehand it. And as you cut each piece, you take it over to your pattern so you can keep track of where you're at. Now, when I got to the halo around his head, I realized that this piece was going to be way too complex to do as one piece. I originally had thought I could borrow a tool from a friend of mine that is basically a glass bandsaw, but in the end it was broken, couldn't use it. So I made a game day decision and went ahead and divided this up into a few different sections, and I actually like the way it came out in the end. These real small pieces for Tyrion's eyes, nose, ears, and mouth ended up being some of the hardest pieces to make. Once I had all the pieces cut, it was time to start grinding, and the grinder is a tool that has a rotating diamond bit on it, and you use it to soften sharp edges and to make more complex curves that are hard to do by just breaking the glass. So you can see here where I used marker on this piece of glass to get a more precise line because the water from the grinder actually started eating away at the paper, and I just wanted to make sure that I could creep up to this line exactly and get it perfect. And once I had all the pieces ground down, we're left with this super dirty but somewhat recognizable image. The next step is the copper foiling. Now the copper foil is what actually allows the solder to stick to your glass. So I started by cleaning each piece of glass super thoroughly and drying each piece. And now you take this copper foil, which is sticky on one side, and you start sticking it to the edge of the glass, trying to keep it as centered as possible, which is kind of tricky. Then you fold the edges of the foil all the way around the glass. And the final step here is to do the process of burnishing, which is basically just using a hard flat tool to press down the copper onto the glass super flat so that when you're soldering, the solder stays on top of the glass and in a nice tight line. Honestly, this is one of my favorite parts of the build because you finally start seeing all the pieces come together to form the whole. It is, however, incredibly time-consuming. Eventually, I did something that I should have done from the start, and that was to build this jig that would hold all the pieces snugly in their place. Without the jig, as you're adding your pieces, you're slightly moving all the other pieces around them. And then you sort of get to a point where you don't know if the pieces you're putting in are actually working. And I actually had to rebuild a few pieces because I didn't have things lining up the way they should be. Now, since this was my first sort of complex stained glass piece, and because I had made some changes as I went, there were some pretty big gaps at some of the seams along the design. You don't want a big gap because you got to fill those with solder. So what I did was I cut up some copper wire that I had laying around of a couple different gauges, and then I just put it in between those seams to fill up the gap a little bit. Once I had all the gaps filled, it was finally time to start soldering. So the first step is to tack all the pieces together by going around to any place where two or more pieces of glass intersect and adding a bit of solder. This is done so that the pieces don't shift around while you're doing the final soldering. Soldering is a fairly simple process. You start by brushing some liquid flux onto the copper, which helps the solder flow freely and adhere to the copper. Then you touch your soldering iron to the seam, add the solder, and move along the seam in as smooth a fashion as possible. This is one of the most satisfying things to do as you see these lines start to come together. And here's what it looks like with the front completely soldered. Now it was time to very carefully tip the piece out of the frame that was holding it so that I could get to the back to do the soldering on that side. Soldering on the back went much faster because I wasn't too concerned with how it looked, and spoiler alert, it looks pretty bad. Once all the soldering was done, I had to prep the piece to add patina to the solder joints. Patina is a chemical that changes the color of the solder from silver to black. So I cleaned the piece on both sides, and then I scrubbed all the joints with steel wool to get them nice and shiny in preparation for the patina. Applying the patina was the part of this build that I was most concerned about. And that's because I had watched a bunch of different tutorials, and there seemed to be conflicting reports on the best way to do this. Some people said you just dump a bunch of it on and scrub it around. Some people said you have to work in little tiny confined areas. Other people said you just gently wipe it on with a rag. I don't know if I did it right, but it seemed to work, so I let the patina sit on the glass for a little while, and then I took it over to the sink and rinsed the whole thing with a ton of cold water. And I was pretty stoked to finally get to hold this thing up to the light and see what it looked like. So it was finally time to load the window into the frame. I made sure that everything was in the proper orientation, and then I started adding these glazing points which hold the glass into the frame. I ran up to the house and attached it to the hinge, and as you can see, I was pretty pleased with myself. Oh, I almost forgot. My girlfriend had the best reaction when I showed her the glass.
David, so cute.
I am so happy with how this came out. It was way more work than I anticipated, but a very, very fulfilling process. And it just goes to show you that with a little bit of patience and determination,
If you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything.
Thanks so much for watching this video. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and give me a thumbs up and click that subscribe button if you're so inclined. I'll see you on the next one.